first glance, Hulk Hogan's last interview might have seemed lighthearted, reminiscing about beers before workouts, laughing about wild midnight gym sessions, and proudly naming the next generation of wrestling superstars. But hidden beneath the surface was a haunting truth. Just weeks later, Hogan would be gone, dead at 71 from cardiac arrest. What no one knew then was that this would be the final time the wrestling legend would ever speak publicly. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a farewell. This is the tragic truth behind Hulk Hogan's last words, and what happened in the heartbreaking hours before his death. When Hulk Hogan sat down for what would be his final interview, no one, perhaps not even he, realized that it would be his last. Dressed casually and radiating that unmistakable charisma that made him a household name, Hogan seemed to be in good spirits. He laughed, he joked, and he shared stories with the kind of warmth and humility that only comes with age. But underneath that laid-back demeanor, there was an eerie feeling of finality in his words. "That was then, and this is now," he said, after reminiscing about his old wrestling locker room days and the infamous tradition of drinking beer before workouts. It sounded like a man who knew he was closing a chapter. He talked fondly about his late friend, John Matusak, a fellow athlete and actor, recalling how they'd created an annual midnight workout tradition in his honor. They trained until sunrise, hitting every single muscle group while sipping beers. "Not American beers," he chuckled, "but now we got real American beer." It was a moment that revealed Hogan's nostalgia and pride, but also subtly hinted at his growing awareness of his mortality. This wasn't just storytelling, it was legacy building. He wasn't promoting a match or launching a flashy new brand. He was talking about the past, his roots, his friends, and the things that truly mattered to him. And when asked about today's rising stars in WWE, he didn't boast. Instead, he humbly listed names like Seth Rollins, Logan Paul, Cody Rhodes, and Roman Reigns, praising their hustle and talent, acknowledging that the torch had long since passed. He no longer needed to be the face of wrestling. He was content to be the foundation, a pillar, the memory. What fans didn't catch at the time was that this interview wasn't just a glimpse into Hogan's thoughts. It was a quiet farewell. No grand send-off, no curtain call, just a legend sitting down to talk one last time. Despite the strong tone in his voice and the laughter in his eyes, there were signs that Hogan was not well. In the weeks before his death, rumors had started circulating online that he was battling serious health issues. Some even said he was in a coma. His wife, Sky Hogan, quickly dismissed those rumors, claiming Hulk was simply recovering from a neck procedure and that his heart was strong. But behind closed doors, Hogan was fighting a silent war. Years of abuse in the wrestling ring had taken a devastating toll on his body. He once admitted in a 2017 interview that he had no original body parts left, a chilling quote that in retrospect feels like an omen. Surgeries on his knees, hips, spine, and back had become a routine part of his life. Fans had grown used to seeing him walk stiffly, leaning on canes or needing help off the stage. But still, because he was Hulk Hogan, the immortal, the icon, nobody expected it to end so suddenly. In truth, Hogan had been pushing himself far beyond what his body could reasonably handle. That final interview revealed a man still in denial about his physical state. He joked about drinking beer during workouts, about staying in shape, and about keeping up with the boys. But this was a man in his 70s, with over a dozen major surgeries behind him. He had lived with pain every day. He had become a living monument to the price of glory. There was also the psychological weight. The scandal that saw him temporarily removed from the WWE Hall of Fame in 2015 after racist remarks surfaced deeply affected him. Though he was reinstated in 2020, the blow to his reputation haunted him. He had seen the sport he helped build move on without him. In that last interview, Hogan mentioned that wrestlers needed to outthink the office, outthink the business, outthink the company. That wasn't just a comment about strategy. It was a reflection of someone who knew how unforgiving the wrestling world could be, even to its biggest star. On the morning of Hulk Hogan's death, everything unfolded in a blur. It was Thursday, just after 9:50 a.m., when a call came into emergency services from his Clearwater, Florida home. The dispatcher listed the case as cardiac arrest, and within minutes, paramedics from Clearwater Fire and Rescue were racing toward the scene. When they arrived, the reality hit like a thunderclap. Hogan was unresponsive. A bystander managed to capture footage from outside the residence. The video shows medical personnel frantically performing chest compressions on Hogan as they rushed him on a stretcher toward the ambulance. The scene was frantic. The air was heavy. This was not just another emergency call. This was the fall of a titan. Neighbors stood in disbelief, watching a man they had known for decades, who had always seemed bigger than life, now fighting for it. He was transported to a nearby hospital, where doctors tried to revive him. But at 11:17 a.m., Terry Bollea was officially pronounced dead. He was 71 years old. At a press conference later that day, Clearwater Police Major Nate Burnside confirmed there were no signs of foul play or suspicious activity. The cause of death was clear: cardiac arrest. A sudden end, but 1 year's in the making. Just weeks prior, Hogan had been promoting Real American Freestyle, a new amateur wrestling league he was set to launch. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new era, not the end of one. He had spoken with excitement about its debut on Fox Nation. Even in his last days, Hogan was planning for the future. That's what makes his passing so tragic. He wasn't retired. He wasn't fading quietly. He was still dreaming, still building, still fighting. But the body that had carried the weight of Hulkamania for decades could no longer take the pressure. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had spent his life telling fans to never give up, to say your prayers and eat your vitamins, had quietly lost his final battle, one he never let the world see. By the time of his death, Hulk Hogan's legacy was not the clean-cut superhero story fans once believed. It was layered, iconic, tainted, yet resilient. In his final interview, Hogan avoided any direct mention of the controversies that had shadowed his later years, but the silence said more than words, because for every child who idolized Hulkamania, there was an adult who remembered the 2015 scandal that almost erased his name from the wrestling world altogether. It was a low point few celebrities come back from. Hogan had been secretly recorded using racist language during a private conversation tied to a sex tape, which was later published by Gawker. The fallout was immediate and brutal. WWE severed ties, removed him from the Hall of Fame, and pulled his name from their website. For a man who had once carried the brand on his back, it felt like a total excommunication. But Hogan didn't go quietly. He fought back, suing Gawker and winning a $140 million judgment that led to the media company's bankruptcy. It was a staggering legal victory, but the moral damage had already been done. For years afterward, Hogan struggled with his public image. His appearances were limited. He walked a fine line between apologizing and justifying his past. In 2018, he was quietly reinstated into the Hall of Fame. And in 2020, he was inducted again, this time as part of the NWO. But many fans never fully accepted the return. To them, Hogan's era had ended long before the paperwork made it official, and yet he kept showing up, kept trying. That's what made his last interview so strange and sad. There was no mention of vindication, no self-congratulations, no effort to reframe the scandal. It was as if Hogan, after all these years, had finally accepted that some chapters couldn't be rewritten. He wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was just being present. A man who had lived too much, said too much, and lost too much to pretend otherwise. The tension between legend and liability was part of what made that final interview feel so loaded. There was nostalgia, yes, but there was also unspoken regret. You could see it in his eyes when he talked about his bar in Clearwater or his old gear stored in garages. He was a man who had lost control of the narrative for years and was only now taking it back quietly, without asking the world to clap. One of the most heartbreaking threads running through Hulk Hogan's later life was just how much he had sacrificed physically for the empire he helped build. In that last interview, you could hear him joke about training late into the night, still lifting weights and celebrating with beers. But it wasn't bravado, it was armor, a way to laugh through the pain. By 2024, Hogan had undergone more than 24 surgeries. Back, knees, hips, shoulders, every major joint in his body had been sliced open and rebuilt like a machine under constant repair. In past interviews, he'd confessed to feeling like a robot, saying he didn't know if anything in his body was original anymore. "There's no part of me that's mine. he once said. It was said jokingly, but it wasn't a joke. His last known surgery was a serious neck procedure in May 2024, one his wife had tried to downplay when rumors surfaced that he was in a coma. In hindsight, her words now feel like a protective buffer, trying to shield the public from just how dire Hogan's condition had become. This wasn't just a routine recovery. The surgery had taken more out of him than expected, and although he put on a strong face during his final interview, his body language told a different story. He shifted uncomfortably, moved stiffly, and occasionally lost his train of thought. Longtime fans noticed. They flooded comment sections and forums asking if Hogan was okay. "He doesn't look right," one user posted. Another added, "He's slurring a bit. Something's off." They were right. His body had endured the punishment of countless leg drops, chair shots, and slams over 4 decades, and it was collapsing. Yet Hogan never seemed angry about it. He knew the price. He had said it himself before. "If I could go back and do it all again, I would. Every surgery, every injury, it was worth it to live that life." But in that last interview, it felt like he was preparing to let go of that life. Not bitter, just tired. A warrior whose battles had finally caught up with him. Behind the bandana, the shades, and the booming voice yelling, "Brother," there was Terry Bollea, a father, a husband, a man who had lived through public collapse, family strife, and multiple reinventions. And in that final interview, we got rare glimpses of the man behind the persona. It wasn't the Hollywood Hogan or the red and yellow cartoon hero. It was a quieter, softer presence. Someone reflecting more than performing. He talked about his bar, Hogan's Hangout, as if it were his true home now, not the wrestling ring. He smiled when recalling the memorabilia stored in warehouses, his old boots, pinball machines, even wrestling buddies from decades ago. "I got yellow boots with Andre the Giant's blood on them," he joked. But there was something haunting about the image. These were relics, artifacts of a time that would never return. His relationship with his children had long been complicated. Brooke and Nick had grown up under intense scrutiny during the reality TV era of Hogan Knows Best. Their father's scandals, the collapse of his marriage to Linda, and Nick's tragic 2007 car crash had all left deep wounds. Hogan rarely brought it up publicly anymore, but the absence of those names in his last interview, no mention of Brooke, Nick, or Linda, was glaring. Instead, he talked about John Matusak, about loyalty, about honoring the dead. He was speaking about brotherhood, something that wrestling had given him more than anything else. The interview was dotted with subtle goodbyes, honoring fallen friends, reminiscing on old matches, referencing that the boys used to hit the beer before we went to the ring. It wasn't morbid, but it was sobering. Hogan wasn't planning a comeback. He was preparing for closure. And then came the final twist of the knife. Just weeks after that interview aired, the unthinkable happened. Paramedics racing to his home, chest compressions, sirens, a hospital pronouncement at 11:17 a.m. And just like that, the voice of a generation went silent. All that remained was the memory and the video, now hauntingly replayed by fans who realized just how much Hogan said without saying it. As the end drew near, Hogan seemed more reflective than ever. In his final interview, you could sense a quiet pride as he spoke about his legacy. Not just the merchandise, not just the fame, but the matches, the moments, the seismic events that helped turn wrestling into the global juggernaut it is today. To understand why that last conversation hit so hard, you have to remember how large Hogan once loomed in the pop culture landscape. It wasn't just that he headlined WrestleMania, he defined it. WrestleMania 3 remains one of the most legendary events in sports entertainment history, thanks largely to one image: Hulk Hogan body-slamming Andre the Giant in front of 93,000 screaming fans. That wasn't just a wrestling move, it was a generational memory, something etched into the minds of millions who watched it on grainy VHS tapes or grainy live feeds. In his later years, Hogan would talk about that match with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. "Brother, he was 520 pounds, he'd often say, and I had to slam him every night on the road, not just once." It was a story he repeated often, but in his final interview, he didn't brag. He just smiled, as if realizing that moment would outlive him. Then there was the epic clash with The Rock at WrestleMania X8, a showdown of two eras. Hogan, the 80s icon, versus The Rock, the face of the Attitude Era. The Toronto crowd didn't just cheer, they roared. They switched sides mid-match, chanting Hogan's name in deafening unison. It was a rare moment in wrestling where the script bent to the will of the audience, and Hogan embraced it like a master showman. When he was asked about today's talent in his last interview, he praised guys like Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes, and Logan Paul. But there was no jealousy in his voice, just the wisdom of a man who had already played every role: hero, villain, leader, exile. And in those final comments, he was passing the torch one last time. But it was clear, no one would ever really replace him. The real tragedy wasn't that Hogan was gone, it was that we had already been living in a post-Hulkamania world for years. We just didn't want to admit it. Outside the spotlight, Hogan's life had always been more chaotic than fans realized. Clearwater, Florida, where he passed away, became something of a sanctuary for him in his final decade. It was where he launched Hogan's Hangout, a bar and restaurant frequented by fans and locals. It's where he stored years of memorabilia, boots still stained with Andre the Giant's blood, old VHS tapes, unopened boxes of action figures, and even pinball machines featuring his likeness. But Clearwater also became the backdrop for a quieter unraveling. While he smiled on camera and gave tours of his restaurant, behind closed doors, there were whispers about health scares, about isolation, and about depression. The rumors of a coma weren't just media exaggeration. They were born from genuine concern. Those closest to Hogan knew something wasn't right. He was appearing less frequently, moving more slowly, struggling to keep weight on his aging frame. His wife, Sky, had only recently entered the picture. They were married in September 2023. And while the union seemed to give Hogan some peace, others questioned whether it was a genuine new chapter or a last-ditch attempt to reclaim stability. Their relationship was mostly kept out of the public eye, but when Sky was forced to deny Hogan was dying earlier this year, it raised alarms. "His heart is strong," she said. "He's just recovering." But now, that quote sounds like a lifeline, one stretched too thin. And then, there's what happened on the morning of his death. A video surfaced online showing paramedics rushing Hogan out of his home, desperately performing chest compressions. He wasn't moving, not responding. Fans who watched the footage were stunned. The man who once seemed invincible, who'd flexed through surgeries and scandals, was now lying motionless under the hands of EMTs. Clearwater Fire and Rescue did all they could, but by 11:17 a.m., it was over. The home that had once been a fortress of memorabilia had turned into the scene of a farewell. No foul play, no crime, just the quiet end of a giant. The wrestling world froze when the news broke. TMZ confirmed it first. Hulk Hogan, dead at 71. And suddenly, the wave of tributes began to pour in like a tsunami. WWE issued a rare and emotional statement. One of pop culture's most recognizable figures, Hogan helped WWE achieve global recognition in the 1980s. They had stripped his name once, but now, in death, they welcomed him back fully. There would be no more hesitation. The controversies had faded. What remained was legacy. Fans around the world lit up social media. Images of Hulk flexing in red and yellow, of him and Andre, of the NWO days, each photo a reminder of how deeply this man had embedded himself in our culture. You didn't have to love wrestling to know Hulk Hogan. You just had to own a TV. He was that big. Outside Hogan's hangout in Clearwater, a memorial formed. People left flowers, action figures, headbands. They wrote notes on napkins and old photos. Some played his iconic theme, "Real American," from car speakers. Others wept silently, remembering not just a wrestler, but a piece of their childhood. For older fans, it was like losing Superman. For younger fans, it was like watching history close a door. And for the wrestling industry, it was the end of an era they could never replicate. No matter how many attractions WWE discovers, no one will ever fill Hogan's boots. No one will slam Andre the way he did. No one will ignite a crowd with just a flex and a "what you gonna do, brother?" As his body body was taken from the hospital, a quiet reality set in. Hulkamania didn't die. It became immortal. Hogan's final interview, in retrospect, wasn't just an appearance. It was a goodbye, a thank you, a final flex before the lights went out. And when the bell tolled one final time, the world stood still. Not for a wrestler, but for a titan.